Imagine opening your banking app on payday. The number is bigger than it was last year. Your boss gave you a raise, your family congratulates you, you feel like you're moving forward. But somehow, the groceries cost more, rent costs more, insurance costs more, the vacation you planned quietly disappears from your budget. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody announced that your standard of living had been reduced. No law was passed saying your money is worth less. Yet somehow, despite earning more than ever before, you can afford less. That sounds impossible. Until you realize that your salary has two completely different values. One is the number printed on your paycheck. The other is what that number can actually buy. And those two numbers don't always move together. Sometimes they move in opposite directions. Which raises a strange question. If your income keeps going up, how can your life quietly become more expensive at the same time? The answer isn't just inflation. It's the way modern money quietly changes underneath you. And once you see how it works, you'll probably stop looking at raises the same way again. Because in many years, getting paid more is exactly how people become poorer without realizing it. Think back a few decades. Imagine someone earning $30,000 a year. Today that number sounds tiny. But at the time, it could buy a house in many cities, support a family, and still leave room for savings. Now imagine someone earning $80,000 today. The paycheck is much larger. The lifestyle often isn't. Some people earning more money than their parents ever did struggle to buy homes their parents bought with a fraction of the income. How can both of those things be true? Because we naturally compare salaries across time. But the economy compares purchasing power. The economy doesn't care how many zeros are on your paycheck. It only cares what those zeros can exchange for. Imagine getting paid in arcade tokens. Every year your employer gives you 10 more tokens. Sounds great. Except every game in the arcade now costs twice as many tokens to play. You're richer in tokens. Poorer in experiences. Money works the same way. The number matters less than the buying power behind it. Economists have a simple phrase for this. Nominal income versus real income. Nominal income is the number. Real income is what that number actually buys. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most conversations focus on the first one. Your raise is announced in nominal dollars. Your tax bracket is usually discussed in nominal dollars. News headlines celebrate wage growth in nominal dollars. But your life happens in real dollars. You don't buy groceries with percentages. You buy them with purchasing power. So where does that purchasing power go? That's where the story becomes much more interesting. Let's imagine a tiny island with only one bakery. Last year, bread cost $2. You earned $100. You could buy 50 loaves. This year your salary rises to $110. You celebrate. Until you walk into the bakery. Bread now costs $2.50. Now you can only buy 44 loaves. Your paycheck grew. Your buying power shrank. Nobody stole your money. Nothing disappeared from your account. The money simply became less powerful. That's inflation in its simplest form. But inflation itself isn't the real mystery. The mystery is why it keeps happening. Most people imagine inflation as governments wildly printing money. Sometimes that's true. Usually it isn't that dramatic. Modern inflation often begins somewhere much quieter. Imagine businesses facing higher costs. Energy becomes more expensive. Shipping takes longer. Workers negotiate higher wages. Raw materials become harder to find. Companies raise prices. Consumers pay them. Workers then demand higher salaries because prices have risen. Businesses increase prices again to cover those salaries. Round and round it goes. It's less like someone flipping a switch. More like hundreds of tiny decisions slowly pushing prices upward together. Now add another ingredient. Credit. Modern economies don't just run on money. They run on borrowed money. Families borrow for homes. Students borrow for education. Businesses borrow to expand. Governments borrow to fund everything from roads to pensions. Banks create loans. Those loans create new money inside the financial system. More money starts chasing roughly the same amount of goods. If production doesn't grow just as fast, prices tend to rise. Notice something strange. Nobody had to physically print mountains of cash. The money supply expanded anyway. That's one of the least understood parts of modern finance. Most money exists because someone borrowed it into existence. Now think about your employer. Suppose prices across the economy rise by 5%. Employees expect raises. The company increases wages by 4%. Everyone feels relieved. Except, prices already increased by 5%. The raise didn't make workers richer. It simply made them slightly less poor than they would have been. This happens constantly. A headline announces average wages are rising. People celebrate. Then inflation quietly outruns those raises. The celebration was based on the number. Reality was based on purchasing power. This is why politicians love announcing wage growth. The number sounds impressive. Whether that number buys more is a completely different conversation. Here's another twist. Not all prices rise equally. Your streaming subscription might increase by $1. No big deal. But housing? That can double over a decade. Healthcare? Education? Childcare? Those categories often rise much faster than average inflation. Official inflation might say prices increased 3%. But your personal life could easily feel like 8%. Because your biggest expenses don't behave like the average basket economists measure. Your personal inflation rate isn't the national inflation rate. It's the cost of living your particular life. Now imagine two people receiving the exact same raise. One rents. One owns a home with a fixed mortgage from years ago. The renter faces rising housing costs every year. The homeowner's biggest monthly payment barely changes. Same raise. Completely different financial reality. That's why averages hide so much. The economy reports one number. Millions of individual lives experience something very different. Then there's another force working quietly in the background. Taxes. Imagine inflation pushes your salary from $60,000 to $70,000 over several years. Sounds wonderful. But what if you also move into a higher tax bracket even though your purchasing power barely changed? Part of your raise disappears to taxes. Another part disappears to inflation. The headline still says your salary increased. Your wallet disagrees. And then comes the asset gap. This is where things become surprisingly unequal. Suppose inflation increases by 4% every year. Your savings account earns 1%. Each year your money quietly loses value. Now imagine someone who owns apartments, businesses, farmland, or shares of successful companies. Many of those assets rise alongside inflation over long periods. Their wealth keeps adjusting upward. Cash doesn't. So inflation quietly rewards ownership more than saving. The irony is difficult to ignore. The people who save money exactly as they were taught often watch purchasing power slowly disappear. The people who own productive assets frequently see their wealth grow faster than inflation. Not always. Markets go down. Businesses fail. Real estate crashes. But over long stretches, ownership has usually adapted better than idle cash. That's one reason wealth gaps often widen during inflationary periods. Not because everyone suddenly works harder. Because different types of assets respond differently when money itself changes. Let's zoom out even further. Why don't governments simply stop inflation completely? Because zero inflation creates its own problems. People delay spending. Businesses hesitate to invest. Debt becomes heavier because every dollar owed becomes harder to earn. Most central banks actually aim for a small amount of inflation every year. Not because inflation feels good. Because they believe a little helps keep economic activity moving. It's a balancing act. Too little creates one set of risks. Too much creates another. The difficult part is that ordinary people experience the downside much more directly than the theory. Nobody notices 2% inflation on a chart. They notice paying $20 more at the grocery store every week. Over enough years, those small increases become enormous. 2% sounds harmless. Until you remember it compounds. Just like investment returns. Except in reverse. Prices don't simply rise. Higher prices become the foundation for even higher prices later. Quietly. Patiently. Year after year. Now think about raises differently. Imagine your salary rises 3% every year. Sounds steady. Comforting even. But if living costs rise 4% every year, you're moving backward despite climbing upward on paper. It's like walking up a downward moving escalator. You're working. You're advancing. You're just not advancing fast enough. That's why so many households feel confused. Employment numbers look healthy. Wages are rising. The economy appears strong. Yet dinner conversations sound completely different. People feel squeezed. Not because they're imagining it. Because their lived experience measures purchasing power, not payroll statistics. Perhaps the strangest part of all this is psychological. Humans naturally anchor to numbers. A 6-figure salary sounds successful. A 7-figure net worth sounds extraordinary. But numbers without context can become financial illusions. $100,000 in one city creates comfort. In another, it barely covers necessities. The same salary means different lives because prices shape reality more than income does. Money has never really been about numbers. It's about access. Access to food, housing, time, security, opportunity. Those are the things your paycheck is actually trying to buy. So the next time someone proudly announces that average wages reached a record high, there's another question worth asking. Did purchasing power reach a record high too? Because those are not the same story. One measures bigger numbers. The other measures better lives. And history shows they often drift apart without anyone noticing immediately. That's the unsettling feature of modern economies. They rarely make you poorer overnight. They do it gradually. Quietly enough that every individual increase feels manageable. Until one day you realize the lifestyle your previous generation built on an ordinary income now requires an extraordinary one. Maybe the real measure of wealth was never how much money we earn. Maybe it's how much of life that money can still purchase. And if those two things continue moving in opposite directions, what exactly does a pay raise really mean anymore?